I'm Nima Rajan. China did not release any information today on what happened at the trial of Canadian Michael Kovrig. Foreign Affairs Minister Marc Garneau says the government is deeply troubled by the total lack of transparency and is continuing to work toward an end to the arbitrary detention of Mr. Kovrig and Michael Spavor. The Canadian Embassy's Deputy Chief of Mission, Jim Nicol, remained outside the courthouse until after dark, waiting for information. China says the trials are being conducted behind closed doors because they involve state secrets. Beijing is seen as using Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor as leverage to obtain the release of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou, who was arrested in Vancouver at the request of the U.S. in December 2018. The nation's leading physician says the vaccine rollout has resulted in a drop in cases in people 80 and over. Dr. Teresa Tam says the reduction offers reassurances that vaccines will bring more and greater benefits in the weeks to come. The provinces are reporting 91,952 new shots in arms for a total just shy of 4 million doses given. Canada's COVID-19 case count is 933,785. The virus has claimed 22,676 lives across the country. Well, with more and more vaccine shipments arriving in Canada, provincial and territorial health officials are expanding their COVID-19 vaccination approvals. Several provinces will now begin to offer COVID-19 shots to a broader range of age groups. Ontario residents aged 75 and up can now book vaccines through the government's online system, and some pharmacies and family doctors can administer the Oxford AstraZeneca shot to anyone 60 or older. Quebec is expecting to start vaccinating people 65 and up in Montreal area pharmacies today. In eastern Canada, New Brunswick is stepping up a program to vaccinate high school teachers against COVID-19 and plans to have 4,500 staff members get their first shots this week. Meanwhile, health officials in Nova Scotia say that the province has tallied an additional 6 new cases of COVID-19. They're also issuing an exposure alert for 8 locations in the Dartmouth area, which are mostly supermarkets. And Newfoundland and Labrador is down to just 5 active cases after a weekend with 0 new infections reported. The federal New Democrats will be looking for help in an effort to convince the government to eliminate for-profit long-term care. Expected to get tabled today, the motion would call on the government to transition existing for-profit homes into not-for-profit operations by 2030. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said he respects provincial authority when it comes to long-term care and supports the sector through billions of dollars in additional funding allocated to provinces during the COVID-19 crisis. Relatives of a young Indigenous man shot and killed on a Saskatchewan farm are expected to address findings from a watchdog's review that concluded RCMP racially discriminated against his mother, asking if she had been drinking and telling her to get it together. A commission also says Mounties failed to protect the SUV that Mr. Bushi was in when he died, resulting in the loss of blood spatter and other evidence. The National Police Federation Union says the watchdog report generally shows police did a professional investigation and questioned the finding on discrimination. Roman Catholic parishes in the St. John's, Newfoundland area will soon hear more about what properties will be sold to compensate victims of abuse at Mount Cashel Orphanage. St. John's Archbishop Peter Hunt sent a letter over the weekend to say a major restructuring of parishes and the diocese is in works. He says parishes should expect to see some properties listed on the real estate market in the weeks to come. The bishop also says in the letter that information is still being gathered and decisions will be communicated to individual parishes as they are made. Alberta's premier says he has been assured that Canadian Pacific Railway's deal to buy U.S. rival Kansas City Southern will not result in job losses in Calgary. Jason Kenney tweeted that he has been briefed by the companies and says Calgary will remain the global headquarters for the merged firm, while Kansas City, Missouri, will house its U.S. headquarters. He says the combined rail network will allow CP to seamlessly transport Alberta energy directly to Gulf Coast refineries. Experts say a solution to North America's polarizing pipeline battles will likely come not from the courtroom, but from the classrooms producing the next generation of oil and gas leaders. Peter Tertzakian, an energy economist and business professor at the University of Calgary, says young people coming into the industry are very smart and energetic, but also frustrated and confused because of the negative stigma around the business. He says the challenge going forward is to reframe the pipeline debate to focus on which companies should be the ones meeting the ongoing demand for fossil fuels. All right, up next, we take a look at a new memoir released by a former bush pilot, which details dangerous and beautiful adventures from Canada's northern provinces. We speak with famed French aviator turned Canadian bush pilot Dominique Prinet, the author of Flying to Extremes, after the break. This story and more national and international news coming up on the Forum Daily. A new and unique memoir was released last week, which highlights stories from one of the most beautiful and remote places in Canada. The book Flying to Extremes by famed French aviator turned Canadian bush pilot Dominique Prinet highlights the stories of the North, as Mr. Prinet recounts his flying adventures in the northern provinces while capturing the unique culture of Indigenous and northern communities. The book takes place in the 1960s when Mr. Prinet was a young Arctic pilot who contributed to the French aviation magazine Aviasport. Some of his adventures include flying through long Arctic winter nights with no daylight for weeks. Mr. Prinet would land his plane on sandbars, rivers, lakes, and the tundra, flying the area's trappers, prospectors, miners, and adventurers to some of the most remote locations in Canada. And to share some of his adventures with us today, we are joined by Mr. Dominique Prinet himself, the author of Flying to Extremes. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Now, not a lot of people have an exciting life as yours. What got you into the aviation industry in the first place?
Well, in the early 40s, when I was a kid, I was fascinated by the rapid evolution of aviation. And also at the end of the war, I was 4 or 5, I saw some fighters shooting at each other above Paris and later on above the family castle east of France in September 44. So I found it very thrilling, and I decided I should become a pilot.
Now, not a lot of people have the opportunity to explore Canada's vast northern provinces. What areas of the north have you been able to see in your experience?
We covered the whole Northwest Territories and what is now Nunavut, from Alaska to the north side of the Hudson Bay, and went up to the close to the North Pole. I did a horrible flight in February in 50 below in the dark, all the way up to the 80th parallel. It was so cold inside the otter that my passengers passed on a bottle of whiskey to me, and I thought it was to cheer me up because I was terrified. But no, it was just to show me that the whiskey was frozen.
Wow.
Inside the cabin.
Wow. And I read a couple of your stories, and you've been in a lot of dangerous situations as well. I really want to share one of these interesting stories mentioned in your memoir. You've been in a situation where you had to rescue your bride from a plane that was sinking through ice. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about this situation?
Yes, I went to a point east of Great Slave Lake in November, and I know it was 35 below because my wife, who was my passenger, had some fuel to bring to a camp. And as soon as we landed, we went through the ice. So the airplane was standing at 45 degrees through the ice, and we could see the bottom of the lake. It was difficult to wait until the airplane sailed fully flat on the ice, and then we came out from under the water. But the camp was empty. So I was desperately looking for matches, couldn't find any. The 3 shacks were empty. And eventually I came back to the shack where my wife was. By then, it was about 10 minutes gone, and I was frozen solid. My hands were curled up. There was ice all over our clothes. And I closed the door so that we'd die here in the cabin and the wolves wouldn't eat us. And then I looked around one last time, and I found a little package of matches, paper matches. So I ran to the last shack, which had a little stove, tore off some paper. That little package of matches, they all came off because I had lost to use my fingers. They all came off at once, and they all lit up at once. So it was a one-time shot. And the next day, a twin-engine airplane came in and spotted us and dropped a little message saying he'd come back and pick us up later. And then the day after, I heard some tinklings along the lake, and it was a First Nation guy who came in with his dog team looked at the airplane and he said, "Oh, the ice is not too thick, is it?" I said, "Yeah, I noticed." And then he said, "Well, the ice is too thin. I can't take you to my community, which is about 30 or 40 kilometers, Fort Reliance." But he said, "I'll come back later on." And then the day after, a helicopter came in with two mechanics, and they chopped the ice around the airplane with a power saw, and the helicopter lifted the airplane off the ice. The helicopter took us back to town, and the two mechanics fixed the airplane. The propeller was a bit bent, and then flew the airplane back to town the day after. So that was a fairly close call.
Definitely a close call, Mr. Prinet. Sounds like something right out of a movie. So if anyone's interested in reading the book, it's called Flying to Extremes, everyone. We'll be right back after the break. Stay tuned. The federal Conservative Party convention over the weekend touched on a lot of key Canadian concerns, with party leader Erin O'Toole trying to unite Conservatives on a number of issues as Canada heads towards a potential election. However, efforts to enshrine the reality of climate change in official Conservative Party policy failed this weekend, despite Mr. O'Toole's efforts to position his party as serious on environmental issues. Though the party's policy declaration already contains a lengthy section on that subject, 54% of delegates voted against expanding it to include the sentence, "We recognize that climate change is real," and also the need for highly polluting businesses to take more responsibility to reduce emissions. Nevertheless, the spotlight in the convention was cast on Mr. O'Toole's proposed recovery plan, in which Mr. O'Toole says his government would restore 1 million jobs lost to the COVID-19 pandemic within a year. He is also pledging to boost healthcare funding to the provinces for mental health programs and to bolster the supply of made-in-Canada medicines and vaccines. Well, to talk more on the Conservative Convention, we are joined by Tony Clement, the host of Boom and Bust. Welcome back to Forum Daily, Tony.
Nice to be here.
Now, one of the things making headlines over the weekend was the Conservative vote on climate change, which lost by 54%. Was this outcome surprising?
It was a little bit, to be frank. You expect that if these policy resolutions come to the floor, that they'll generally pass. And I think 35 or 36 out of the 40 resolutions did pass. So to have one of these fail and that be that one must have come as a surprise. But I think Erin O'Toole's response the very next day was the right one. Say, look, we're going to have a climate change policy. He said that during the leadership before he was elected leader, so people knew what they were getting. And it should be a policy that is based on reality. So I don't think any of that changes.
Now, considering that Mr. O'Toole said that an ambitious climate change agenda is a must if the party hopes to win power, how will the results of this particular climate change vote impact the Conservatives' efforts to win a majority in a potential election?
Well, it was always going to be the case that the governing Liberals and their war machine were going to cast Erin O'Toole as anti-climate. That was always going to be part of their playbook in the election. So that really doesn't change. They've got a little bit more grist for their mill, I must say. But again, I think ultimately it's going to be Erin O'Toole expressing his policy alternatives to this job-killing carbon tax that the Liberals have been pursuing. And it has to be a realistic alternative, and it has to really go to Canadian strengths, industrial strengths, and the strengths of our various regions. So I think that's the task for Erin O'Toole between now and Election Day.
All right, let's talk about the other motions discussed at the convention, like the Conservatives' proposed recovery plan. What are some of the key takeaways from this particular plan?
Well, I think in your intro, you talked about the mental wellness aspect of it, the made in Canada vaccine and supply chain to deal with future pandemics. And of course, there's a jobs component, get back the jobs that were lost within 1 year. So what I take out of this, Nima, is this, though. This is a realistic plan that deals with our immediate emergency. He's not trying to do pie in the sky. 10 years from now, here's my vision for Canada, or 20 years from now, he's saying, look, we've got some immediate goals that the Liberals will not deliver on. Here is how he's going to flesh out over time how the Conservative Party will deliver on those goals. And so I'm seeing it as looking at it from the immediate crisis point of view and having solutions for that crisis.
Now, as mentioned, there was talk on investing more in the healthcare space. As a former health minister yourself, Tony, what is currently needed in Canada's medical system in order to come out of this pandemic stronger? And were all these concerns addressed in Mr. O'Toole's recovery plan?
It's two words, Nima. It's supply chain. So you need a better supply chain for domestically produced PPE, personal protective equipment. You need the creation of a supply chain when it comes to vaccine development and distribution. So all of these things, medical devices, all of these things that will help prevent a future pandemic from hitting us as hard as this one hit us, and basically having a more robust medical sector for whatever comes down the pipeline.
All right, Tony, about 40 seconds left, but how likely are we to see a federal election on the horizon? And when do you think something like this would occur?
Well, that's the big guessing game in Ottawa these days. When's the election? There's, late spring is one option, early fall is another. I think that the odds are greater for late spring now with the budget being postponed. So maybe the budget will be a bit closer to April or May, and then we'll have an election soon after.
All right, Tony, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time today.
For sure. Thanks.
All right, stay tuned. We've got top stories from around the world coming up after the break as the U.S. struggles with a surge in migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border. That and more news from around the world coming up, so stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back. President Joe Biden's administration has been caught on its heels as migrants surge at the U.S.-Mexico border. It is now scrambling to manage what has become a humanitarian and political crisis. Administration officials say Mr. Biden inherited the situation that resulted from former President Donald Trump's weakening of the immigration system. Career immigration officials had warned that there could be a surge after the November election and the news that Mr. Trump's policies were being reversed. AstraZeneca's COVID-19 vaccine provided strong protection against the disease and complete protection against hospitalizations and death across all age groups in a late-stage U.S. study. The U.S. study found that the shot was 79% effective in preventing symptomatic COVID and 100% effective in stopping severe disease and hospitalization. The early findings from the U.S. study are just one set of findings that AstraZeneca must submit to the Food and Drug Administration. The vaccine has not been approved in the U.S. A protest in the West England city of Bristol against new policing legislation descended into violent clashes that left at least 20 police officers injured, 2 of them seriously. Britain's Interior Minister has condemned the protest. She branded the scenes, which also saw several police vehicles damaged, as unacceptable. Many who attended the protest on College Green in the heart of the city were wearing face masks and carried signs saying, "Say no to UK police state." Greece's health minister is requisitioning the services of private sector doctors to help fight a renewed surge in coronavirus infections that is straining hospitals and their limits. Vasilis Kekalias said Monday that despite repeated appeals to private sector doctors to volunteer to help in the public sector, very few came forward. Greece has been experiencing a renewed surge of COVID-19 despite lockdown-related measures being enforced since early November, with dozens of daily deaths and increasing numbers of patients hospitalized in intensive care units. Rescuers and activists say artillery shells fired from government areas have hit a major hospital in a rebel-controlled town in northwestern Syria, killing at least 6 civilians, wounding medical staff, and forcing it to shut down. The shells landed on Sunday at the entrance and in the courtyard of the hospital in Athareb, a town in rural western Aleppo. The hospital is located underground to avoid targeting in the conflict-prone area. Attacks on hospitals are common in the 10-year-old Syrian conflict. China says more than 200 of its fishing vessels have anchored at a reef claimed by the Philippines to avoid bad weather. They sidestepped accusations by Manila that they are involved in a move by Beijing's South China Sea maritime militia to assess control in the area. The Philippine Defense Secretary called Sunday for China to stop this incursion and immediately recall the boats that are violating their maritime rights and encroaching into their sovereign territory. Healthcare workers have marched through Myanmar's second biggest city, kicking off another day of countrywide protests against last month's coup. About 100 doctors, nurses, medical students, and pharmacists lined up yesterday on a main road in Mandalay to voice their opposition to the February 1st coup that toppled the elected civilian government. Elsewhere, police have used violence against protesters, and security forces have shot dead at least one person. The European Union is set to slap sanctions on 11 officials accused of involvement in the military coup in Myanmar. Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell said, quote, "We are going to take sanctions against 11 persons involved in the coup and on the repression of the demonstrators." Last month's coup reversed years of slow progress toward democracy in Myanmar after 5 decades of military rule. The military junta has responded with an increasingly violent crackdown in the face of persistent strikes and protests. Well, on World Water Day, Pope Francis is urging more efforts to ensure all people have access to drinking water. Pope Francis says that, quote, "Water isn't some good of commerce, but rather a fount of life and of health." He affirmed those that are working toward water access and cited those in his homeland, Argentina, who are working on water projects. The World Health Organization says some 2 billion people use a source of drinking water that is contaminated. 12 men built a 65-square-foot igloo last week over 4 days in Iqaluit, Nunavut, to hold a performing arts festival over the weekend. The team carved out over 700 snow blocks weighing 80 pounds each and stacked them by hand from dawn until dusk. One of the festival's organizers said he never thought holding an event inside an igloo in the middle of a pandemic would have ever been possible. But Nunavut's chief public health officer approved the festival as there are no cases of COVID-19 in Iqaluit. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for news on demand, you can visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and be sure to follow us on our social media handles, available on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also watch all of our news and commentary programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. All right, thank you for joining us on the Forum Daily, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Take care.